My name is Lydia Harris, and I am 61 years old. The story I'm about to tell you happened over 20 years ago, but the memories are as vivid as if they occurred yesterday. Some nights, I still wake up trembling, feeling the cold iron shackles around my wrists, hearing the auctioneer's voice echoing through my mind. But I'm here now, free, and it's time I shared what happened, not just for myself, but for all those whose voices were silenced. It was a humid July morning in 1843 when I stood on that auction block in Charleston. I was 8 months pregnant, my belly swollen with life even as I faced the possibility of death. The sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden platform, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back, soaking through the thin, tattered dress they'd given me to wear. Around me, dozens of people gathered, white men in fine suits, some with their wives dressed in elaborate gowns, all examining us like we were livestock at a county fair. My hands instinctively moved to protect my unborn child, but the overseer slapped them away. "Stand straight," he barked. "Let them see what they're buying." I'd been sold twice before. The first time I was only 7 years old, torn from my mother's arms on a plantation in Virginia. I can still remember her screams, the way she clawed at the slave trader's coat as he dragged me away. The second time, I was 19, sold to a tobacco farmer in North Carolina after my previous owner died. But this third time was different. This time, I carried a life within me, a child conceived not from love, but from violence inflicted by the overseer on that North Carolina plantation. The auctioneer, a portly man with a thick mustache and tobacco-stained teeth, began his pitch. "Gentlemen, we have here a fine specimen, strong, healthy, experienced in field work and domestic duties. And as you can see, she comes with additional value." He gestured crudely at my pregnant belly, and several men in the crowd laughed. I forced myself to look straight ahead, refusing to meet their eyes. I'd learned long ago that showing emotion, fear, anger, sadness, only made things worse. But inside, my heart was breaking. What kind of world was this, where a woman heavy with child could be sold like a piece of furniture? Where was God in all of this suffering? A tall man near the front caught my attention. He wore a black suit and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Unlike the others, he wasn't laughing or making crude comments. He simply watched, his expression unreadable. Something about him made my skin crawl. Not because he seemed cruel, but because he seemed calculating, as if he were assessing a business investment rather than looking at a human being. "Bidding starts at $400, the auctioneer announced. The numbers flew back and forth. 500, 600. I tried to block it out, tried to retreat into that place in my mind where I'd learned to hide when reality became unbearable. I thought about my mother, wondering if she was still alive. I thought about the child growing inside me, and I prayed, though I'd almost stopped believing anyone was listening, that somehow this baby would have a better life than I'd had. $1,000. The voice belonged to the man in the black suit. The crowd fell silent. $1,000 was an extraordinary sum, especially for someone in my condition. The auctioneer's eyes widened with greed. $1,000. Do I hear 1,100? 1,100, gentlemen? No one else bid. Perhaps they were intimidated by the stranger's wealth, or perhaps they thought he was foolish to pay so much. Either way, the gavel came down. Sold to Mr. Jonathan Whitmore of Oak Ridge Plantation for $1,000. As the overseer unchained me from the post and led me down from the platform, I caught a glimpse of Mr. Whitmore's face. His eyes were cold, gray as storm clouds, and for the first time since the auction began, I felt genuine terror. I'd been purchased by men who beat me, men who worked me until I collapsed, men who violated me. But something about Jonathan Whitmore was different. There was an intelligence in those eyes, a methodical quality that suggested whatever he had planned for me was calculated and deliberate. He didn't speak to me as his men loaded me onto a wagon with 3 other newly purchased people. 2 men and a young woman who couldn't have been more than 16. We were chained together, our wrists raw and bleeding from the iron cuffs. The journey to Oak Ridge Plantation took 3 days, traveling through the oppressive heat of the South Carolina lowcountry. During those 3 days, I learned what I could from the others in the wagon. The older of the 2 men, Samuel, had been sold away from his family in Georgia. The younger man, Thomas, had tried to escape from his previous owner, and bore the scars of his punishment across his back. The girl, Ruth, had been born into slavery on a cotton plantation and had never known anything else. Her eyes were vacant, already dead in a way that made my heart ache. On the second night, as we camped beside a creek, Ruth whispered to me in the darkness, "Why did he pay so much for you?" I had no answer. I'd been asking myself the same question. "My mama used to say," Ruth continued, her voice barely audible, "that when a master pays that much, he's got special plans, breeding plans." The words sent ice through my veins. I knew what she meant. Some plantation owners had begun treating their enslaved people like cattle, deliberately breeding them to produce more workers. My unborn child, already conceived in violence, might be destined for an even worse fate. When we finally arrived at Oak Ridge Plantation, I understood why Mr. Whitmore had been so calculating. The plantation wasn't like others I'd seen. It was massive, with hundreds of acres of cotton fields stretching as far as the eye could see. The main house was a 3-story mansion with white columns surrounded by magnolia trees. But it was the other buildings that caught my attention, row after row of slave quarters, far more than any plantation would normally need. And behind the main house, partially hidden by oak trees draped with Spanish moss, stood a large wooden structure that looked like a barn, but somehow felt different, wrong. Even from a distance, that building filled me with dread. Mr. Whitmore finally spoke to me as his men unchained us from the wagon. "You'll work in the big house until the child comes," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "After that, we'll discuss your permanent assignment." "Yes, master," I whispered, the words tasting like ashes in my mouth. As they led us to our quarters, a cramped cabin I would share with Ruth, I glanced back at that mysterious barn. In the fading evening light, I could see figures moving around it, and I could hear sounds I couldn't quite identify: hammering, sawing, and occasionally something that might have been crying. That night, as I lay on the thin straw mattress with my hand on my swollen belly, I made a promise to my unborn child. Whatever happened, whatever horrors awaited us in that barn or anywhere else on this plantation, I would survive. I would protect this baby, and somehow, someday, we would both be free. I had no idea how I would keep that promise. I had no idea what Jonathan Whitmore had planned. But I knew with absolute certainty that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't yet imagine. The barn waited in the darkness, keeping its secrets, but not for long. The main house at Oak Ridge Plantation was a world unto itself, far removed from the brutal realities of the fields, yet no less suffocating. For 3 weeks, I worked alongside 6 other women in the kitchen and dining areas, my pregnant belly making every task more difficult. We rose before dawn and worked until long after the Whitmore family had retired for the evening. Mrs. Caroline Whitmore was a small, delicate woman with pale skin and hair the color of wheat. She moved through the house like a ghost, rarely speaking above a whisper, her eyes constantly darting toward her husband as if seeking permission to exist. I quickly learned that she had no real authority in the household. All decisions, from the menu for dinner to the punishment of house servants, came from Mr. Whitmore himself. The Whitmores had 3 children: Jonathan Jr., who was 20 and already managing portions of the plantation; Elizabeth, a quiet 16-year-old who spent most of her time reading in the library; and young Thomas, age 12, who had inherited his father's calculating eyes and cruel streak. It was Thomas who made my first weeks in the big house particularly unbearable. "Why is she so fat?" he asked one morning at breakfast, pointing at me as I served his mother's tea. "Hush, Thomas," Mrs. Whitmore said softly, but there was no conviction in her voice. "She's carrying a child," Mr. Whitmore explained calmly, cutting into his ham. "She'll be more valuable after it's born. We can put her to work in the barn project." The barn project. Those words kept coming up, always spoken in hushed tones, always followed by significant looks between the white overseers. No one would tell us what it meant, but the fear in the eyes of the other enslaved people told me everything I needed to know. Whatever happened in that barn, it was terrible. My closest companion during those weeks was an older woman named Sarah. She'd worked in the big house for 30 years since she was a young girl, and she knew every secret, every whisper, every hidden corner of the plantation. Late at night, after our work was done, She would share what she knew. "That barn," she told me one evening as we scrubbed the kitchen floor, "it ain't for storing cotton or tobacco." "What's it for then?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Sarah's hand stilled in the soapy water. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Master Whitmore, he got ideas. Been reading books about breeding, about making stronger workers. That barn, that's where he keeps the women he's chosen for his breeding program." My blood ran cold. "Breeding program? Like horses or cattle?" Sarah continued, her eyes filling with tears. "He picks the strongest men, the healthiest women, and he forces them together. Keeps track of everything in his ledgers. Who's matched with who, when babies are born, which ones grow strong, which ones get sold off. My own daughter, Rebecca, she's been in there for 2 years now. Had 3 babies already, and she's only 19 years old." I placed my hand protectively over my belly. "Does Mrs. Whitmore know?" Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "Mrs. Whitmore knows everything and nothing. She sees what she wants to see, believes what she's told to believe. That woman lives in her own world, where everything is proper and Christian and right, while the rest of us suffer in hell." The next morning my water broke. It happened while I was carrying breakfast trays to the dining room. Suddenly, warmth flooded down my legs and a sharp pain tore through my abdomen. The trays clattered to the floor, china shattering across the polished wood. Mrs. Whitmore gasped, Elizabeth screamed, and Mr. Whitmore simply stood up and called for the overseer. "Get her to the birthing cabin," he ordered. "Have Martha attend to her." The birthing cabin was a small structure behind the slave quarters, where all the enslaved women went to deliver their children. It was dark, hot, and smelled of blood and fear. Martha, an elderly midwife who delivered hundreds of babies over her lifetime, took one look at me and shook her head. "This one's going to be difficult," she muttered. Babies turned wrong. The labor lasted 23 hours. I'd never experienced pain like that. Not from beatings, not from field work, not from any of the horrors I'd endured. It felt like my body was being torn apart from the inside. Martha did everything she could, using techniques passed down through generations, but as the hours wore on, I began to lose hope. "I'm going to die," I whispered during a brief respite between contractions. "No, you ain't," Martha said firmly. "You're going to push, and you're going to bring this baby into the world, and you're going to survive. You hear me?" I wanted to believe her, but the pain was overwhelming. Several times, I felt myself slipping away, retreating into that dark place where nothing could hurt me anymore. But each time, Martha's voice pulled me back. "Push, Lydia! Now!" Finally, as dawn broke on the second day, my daughter entered the world. She came out silent, blue, not breathing, and for one terrible moment, I thought I'd lost her. But Martha worked quickly, clearing her airways, rubbing her chest, and suddenly, miraculously, my baby girl let out a strong, healthy cry. Tears streamed down my face as Martha placed her in my arms. She was tiny, wrinkled, covered in blood and fluid, but she was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. In that moment, despite everything, despite the chains, despite the auction block, despite the horrors of Oak Ridge Plantation, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. "What will you name her?" Martha asked. I thought about my own mother, about the day I was torn from her arms. I thought about all the women who'd suffered before me, all the mothers who'd had their children ripped away, and I knew exactly what my daughter's name would be. "Grace," I whispered. "Her name is Grace." For 3 precious days, they let me rest and bond with my baby. I nursed her, held her, sang to her the songs my own mother had sung to me. Martha taught me how to care for her, how to swaddle her properly, how to recognize the signs if something was wrong. Those 3 days felt like a lifetime, like a small pocket of peace in the middle of a war. But on the 4th day, Mr. Whitmore came to the birthing cabin. He didn't knock, didn't ask permission, just walked in and stared at me, nursing my daughter. His cold gray eyes assessed us like we were nothing more than livestock he'd invested in. "The child looks healthy," he said. "Good. You've proven your value." I pulled Grace closer to my chest, instinctively protecting her. "Tomorrow, you'll begin work in the barn," he continued. "You can bring the infant with you for the first 6 months while she nurses. After that, she'll be cared for in the nursery with the other children." Please, I heard myself say, though I knew begging was useless. Please don't separate us. Mr. Whitmore's expression didn't change. You're not in a position to make requests. You belong to me, as does that child. You'll do as you're told, when you're told. Tomorrow morning, the overseer will escort you to the barn. Sarah will explain your duties. He left without another word, and I sat there trembling, holding my baby girl against my chest. The small pocket of peace had shattered. Tomorrow, I would finally learn what happened in that barn, the place that had haunted my nightmares since I'd arrived at Oak Ridge. That night, Sarah came to visit me one last time before my assignment began. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry you have to go through this. What happens there, Sarah? Tell me everything." She took a deep breath and began to explain. The barn was divided into sections, one for the women who'd been selected for breeding, one for the men, and one for record-keeping and medical examinations. Mr. Whitmore had hired a doctor from Charleston, a man who shared his twisted vision of creating the perfect slave workforce. They kept meticulous records of every coupling, every pregnancy, every birth. "But that ain't the worst part," Sarah continued. "The worst part is what he does to test them. The children, I mean. When they get old enough, he runs them through trials, makes them work longer than anyone should, pushes them past their limits, all to see which ones are strongest. The weak ones get sold off. The strong ones stay for breeding when they come of age." I felt sick. My beautiful Grace, my tiny miracle, was destined for this horror. "There has to be a way out," I said desperately. "There has to be." Sarah shook her head sadly. "The only way out is death or freedom. And we ain't likely to find either one here. But Lydia, listen to me. You're strong, stronger than most. If anyone can survive that barn and protect their child, it's you. Don't give up hope." After Sarah left, I lay awake all night, holding Grace close, feeling her tiny heartbeat against my chest. I thought about escape, but how far would a newly delivered woman with an infant get before the dogs caught up? I thought about resistance, but that would only bring punishment down on my baby's head. I thought about giving up, but Grace deserved better than a mother who'd surrendered to despair. By the time dawn broke, I'd made my decision. I would survive. I would protect my daughter. And somehow, some way, I would find a way to break free from this nightmare. I didn't know how long it would take. Months, years, perhaps decades. But I would never stop fighting. The overseer came for me just after sunrise. As I walked toward that barn with Grace in my arms, I held my head high. They could chain my body, but they could never chain my spirit. They could take everything from me, but they couldn't take away my love for my child or my determination to see her free. The barn doors swung open, revealing the darkness within, and I walked forward to face whatever horrors awaited me, carrying my daughter toward an uncertain future, but refusing to let fear win. This was just the beginning of my story. The worst was yet to come. The interior of the barn was worse than anything I'd imagined. The structure was divided into sections by wooden partitions, creating a maze of small rooms and corridors. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and something else, something medicinal that burned my nostrils. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through high windows, I could make out faces watching me from the shadows. Women's faces, hollow-eyed and haunted. The overseer, a brutal man named Collins, led me through the main corridor. Grace whimpered against my chest, sensing my fear. I held her tighter, whispering reassurances I didn't believe myself. "This here's your section," Collins said, stopping before a small room, barely 8 feet square. Inside was a wooden bed frame with a thin mattress, a bucket, and nothing else. "You'll sleep here. Work schedule's posted on the main board. Doctor comes every Friday for examinations. You don't cause trouble, you don't get hurt. Simple as that." After he left, I sat on the bed, taking stock of my surroundings. Through the thin walls, I could hear voices, women talking in hushed tones, a baby crying somewhere nearby, and occasionally, sounds that made my stomach turn. This wasn't just a breeding facility. It was a prison designed to break spirits as thoroughly as it broke bodies. Within an hour, a woman appeared at my door. She was perhaps 30 years old, though her eyes looked ancient. "I'm Rebecca," she said softly. "Sarah's daughter." She asked me to look after you. Rebecca explained the routine of the barn. We woke at dawn for roll call and medical inspection. Afterward, nursing mothers like myself were given time to care for our infants, but only until they reached 6 months. After that, the babies were taken to a nursery where other enslaved women cared for them while their mothers were subjected to Mr. Whitmore's breeding program. How many times? I asked, dreading the answer. How many times what? How many times have they forced you? Rebecca's face went blank, the way mine used to when I needed to retreat from reality. I stopped counting after the first year. My oldest is 2 now. They took him to the nursery when he turned 6 months, and I barely see him. My second baby died during birth. The third, a daughter, is in the nursery too. And they just keep using you? That's the whole point of this place. Master Whitmore believes he can create the perfect workforce through selective breeding. He keeps detailed records of everything, which pairings produce the strongest children, which combinations result in certain traits. He's turned human beings into an experiment. Over the following weeks, I met more women trapped in this nightmare. There was Hannah, who'd had 5 children in 6 years and looked twice her age. There was young Mary, only 15, pregnant with her first child and terrified. There was Violet, who'd gone mad after her 4th baby was sold away and now sat in her room talking to ghosts. Each woman had a story of horror, and each story chipped away at my hope. But I couldn't afford to lose hope. Grace depended on me. The barn operated on a strict schedule. Dr. Morrison, the physician Mr. Whitmore had hired from Charleston, arrived every Friday to conduct examinations. He was a thin man with spectacles and the cold, clinical demeanor of someone who'd forgotten that his patients were human beings. He measured us, weighed us, examined us intimately while taking notes in his leather-bound journal. "Excellent," he murmured during my first examination, prodding my abdomen as I lay on a wooden table, Grace crying in a basket beside me. "The birth caused minimal damage. She'll be ready for the program in another 6 weeks." 6 weeks. I had 6 weeks before they would begin forcing me to produce more children for Mr. Whitmore's twisted experiment. The thought made me physically ill. But Dr. Morrison's visits revealed something important. He was meticulous about his records. Every Friday, he spent hours in a small office in the barn's administrative section, updating ledgers and medical files. The door to that office was locked, but through the thin walls, I could hear him working, muttering to himself as he wrote. Those records held everything: names, dates, pairings, births, deaths, sales. If anyone ever needed proof of what was happening at Oak Ridge Plantation, those records would provide it. The question was, how could I possibly access them? As the weeks passed, I began to understand the barn's social structure. There was a clear hierarchy among the women. Those who'd been there longest had a certain status, a knowledge of how to navigate the system and minimize suffering. Rebecca, despite her pain, had become one of these leaders. She taught newer women how to survive, how to avoid Collins's particular brutality, which guards might show small mercies. "There's a woman in the East Wing," Rebecca told me one night, her voice barely audible. "Her name is Patience. She's been here since the barn opened 5 years ago. She knows things about the guards' routines, about weak points in the structure, about ways to communicate with the field workers." "Why are you telling me this?" Rebecca looked at me with surprising intensity. "Because Mama said you have fire in you still. Most of us, that fire died long ago. But you might actually have a chance to do something." "Do what? Escape? They'd hunt us down before we got 5 miles. Maybe not escape, but maybe something else. Maybe getting proof to the outside world about what happens here. There are abolitionists up north, people who'd be horrified if they knew the truth. If we could somehow get those records to them." It was a desperate, nearly impossible plan, but it was something, and something was more than I'd had since arriving at Oak Ridge. I began observing everything with new eyes. I noted which guards were lazy, which ones cruel, which ones might possibly be sympathetic. I memorized the barn's layout, counting doors and windows, noting which rooms had locks and which didn't. I paid attention to routines, schedules, patterns, and I started building relationships. Every enslaved person I met, I treated with kindness and respect. I helped the other mothers with their children. I shared what little food I received. I listened to their stories without judgment. Slowly, carefully, I began to weave a network of trust. 6 weeks after Grace's birth, Dr. Morrison declared me ready for the program. That night, Collins came to my room with a man I'd never seen before. One of the field workers, strong and young, chosen for his physical attributes. The man looked as horrified as I felt. "I'm sorry," he whispered as Collins locked the door behind him. "I'm so sorry. They said if I didn't cooperate, they'd whip me until I couldn't stand." His name was Daniel, and he was 22 years old. He'd been born into slavery on a plantation in Alabama and had been purchased by Mr. Whitmore 6 months earlier specifically for the breeding program. Over the next hour, as we sat in that locked room, neither of us able to bring ourselves to do what was expected, we talked. "This ain't right," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "None of this is right. We're human beings, not animals." "I know. I tried to run once back in Alabama. They caught me and scarred my back so bad I can't hardly sleep on it anymore. But sometimes I think about trying again. Dying free is better than living like this." We sat in silence for a long time. When Collins finally unlocked the door hours later and saw that we'd accomplished nothing, his face turned purple with rage. The beating he gave Daniel was savage. I held Grace and turned away, unable to watch, tears streaming down my face. This became the pattern of my existence. Every 2 weeks, Collins would lock me in that room with Daniel or one of the other men from the breeding program. Sometimes we submitted, too broken and afraid to resist. Sometimes we didn't, and the punishments that followed were brutal. But through it all, Daniel and I began to form a plan. Daniel worked in the fields and had connections with enslaved people across the plantation. Through careful, whispered conversations during our forced encounters, we began to share information. He told me about the Underground Railroad, about abolitionists who helped escapees reach the North, about sympathetic white people who opposed slavery even here in South Carolina. "There's a woman in town," Daniel said one night, "Mrs. Fletcher. She runs the general store. Word is, she's secretly sympathetic to our cause. If we could get a message to her." "How?" "Once a month, Master Whitmore sends a wagon to town for supplies. Sometimes they take 1 or 2 of us along to help load. If I could get picked for the next trip, maybe I could slip her a note. It was risky, perhaps suicidal, but we were already dying slowly in this barn. What did we have to lose?" Over the next 2 months, I wrote everything down. Using scraps of paper and stolen pencils, I documented everything happening in the barn. Names, dates, Mr. Whitmore's breeding program, Dr. Morrison's experiments, the number of children who'd been born and sold. I hid these papers inside my mattress, adding to them whenever I could. Meanwhile, Rebecca connected me with Patience, the woman from the East Wing. Patience was remarkable. Despite 5 years of unimaginable suffering, she'd maintained a sharp mind and an unbreakable spirit. She'd been secretly teaching other women to read using a Bible she'd hidden, and she'd been documenting the barn's horrors in her memory, waiting for an opportunity to act. "There are more of us than you think," Patience told me during a secret meeting in the dead of night. "People who haven't given up, people who still believe we deserve freedom. If we work together, if we're smart and patient, maybe we can do something that matters." 3 months after I entered the barn, Daniel got his chance. He was selected for the supply run to town. Before he left, I gave him a letter, a carefully written account of the barn's horrors addressed to any person of conscience who reads this. Daniel hid it in his shoe, praying he'd find a way to pass it to Mrs. Fletcher. While he was gone, I barely breathed. Grace was 4 months old now, healthy and beautiful, unaware of the nightmare surrounding her. Every time I looked at her, I felt torn between overwhelming love and crushing despair. What kind of future awaited my daughter in this place? Daniel returned that evening, his face carefully neutral, giving nothing away. But 2 days later, during another forced encounter, he whispered the words I'd been desperate to hear. She got it. Mrs. Fletcher got the letter. For the first time since entering the barn, I felt something other than hopelessness. It was small, fragile, probably foolish, but it was hope. Somewhere in the world beyond Oak Ridge Plantation, someone now knew what was happening here. Someone who might care, someone who might help. But I had no idea how much worse things would get before they got better. and I had no idea that the barn held secrets far darker than even I had imagined. Winter came to Oak Ridge Plantation, bringing cold winds that whistled through gaps in the barn walls. Grace was 5 months old now, growing stronger every day despite our circumstances. I held her constantly, terrified of the approaching 6th month when they would take her to the nursery. Each day felt like borrowed time. The letter Daniel had passed to Mrs. Fletcher had been sent north, or so we hoped. But weeks turned into months with no response, no sign that anyone in the outside world cared about our suffering. The hope that had briefly flickered began to dim. Perhaps the letter had been intercepted. Perhaps Mrs. Fletcher had been arrested for helping us. Perhaps the abolitionists didn't care about enslaved people in South Carolina. Meanwhile, conditions in the barn were deteriorating. Mr. Whitmore had purchased 10 more women for his breeding program, overcrowding the facility. Food rations were cut. Dr. Morrison's examinations became more invasive and painful, and Collins, always cruel, seemed to be growing more violent with each passing week. One freezing January night, everything changed. I was awakened by screaming, not the usual sounds of suffering that had become background noise in the barn, but something different, more desperate. I wrapped Grace in my thin blanket and peered out of my room. Other women were emerging from their rooms too, drawn by the commotion. The screams were coming from the medical examination room. I recognized the voice. It was Mary, the 15-year-old girl who'd been pregnant when I arrived. She'd given birth to a son 2 months ago, and now she was screaming as if her soul was being torn apart. Rebecca grabbed my arm. "Don't go down there." "What's happening?" "They're taking her baby. She tried to hide him, tried to keep them from putting him in the nursery. Collins is beating her." I felt rage surge through me, hot and powerful. Before I could think better of it, I thrust Grace into Rebecca's arms and ran toward the medical room. Other women tried to stop me, but I pushed past them. The scene in the medical room was worse than I'd imagined. Mary lay on the floor, bleeding from a head wound, her arms reaching desperately toward her baby. Collins stood over her, his whip raised. Dr. Morrison held Mary's screaming infant, looking annoyed by the interruption to his evening. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the barn. Collins turned to me, his face contorted with fury. "Get back to your room or you'll get the same. She's just a child herself. Can't you see what you're doing to her?" "I see a slave who needs to learn obedience," Collins snarled. He struck Mary again with the whip, and she let out a sound that barely seemed human. Something inside me snapped. Years of accumulated rage and pain exploded outward. I launched myself at Collins, clawing at his face, screaming words I didn't even recognize. I'd never fought back before. Survival had always meant submission. But watching him brutalize that child broke something fundamental in me. Collins was stronger, but I had the advantage of surprise and fury. We crashed into a table, sending Dr. Morrison's instruments flying. The doctor shouted for help as he retreated with Mary's baby. Other women began pouring into the room, not to stop me, but to join me. Hannah grabbed Collins's whip arm. Violet, the woman who'd gone mad, began throwing medical instruments. Patients appeared, helping Mary to her feet. For 30 seconds, the barn erupted into chaos. Women who'd been broken and submissive suddenly found their voices, their strength, their rage. We weren't thinking about consequences. We were simply reacting to years of torture, to the sight of a child being beaten for the crime of loving her baby. Then the guards arrived. 4 armed men stormed into the medical room, and the brief uprising collapsed. They dragged us apart, throwing women against walls, striking anyone who resisted. I tried to reach Grace, terrified that in the chaos something might happen to her. But a guard's fist caught me in the stomach, driving the air from my lungs. When it was over, Collins's face was bleeding from my scratches, the medical room was destroyed, and 5 of us, Mary, Hannah, Patience, Violet, and I, were chained together and dragged outside. The temperature had dropped below freezing. The guards threw us into a small wooden shed used for storing tools and locked the door. Through gaps in the walls, I could see frost forming on the ground. We had no blankets, no warmth, nothing but each other and our terror. "Grace," I sobbed, pounding on the door. "Please, my baby needs me. She needs to nurse. Please." No one answered. We could hear activity outside, Guards talking, doors slamming, Mr. Whitmore's voice issuing orders. But no one came to let us out or even acknowledge our existence. Mary curled into a ball, still bleeding from Collins's beating. Hannah tried to tear strips from her dress to bandage the girl's wounds, but the cold was making her hands shake so badly she could barely manage. Patience pressed against me, sharing what little body heat we had. Violet had retreated into her own mind, rocking back and forth and singing a lullaby to a child who wasn't there. Hours passed. The temperature continued to drop. My breasts ached with milk, engorged and painful. Grace would be screaming for me, confused and hungry. The thought of her suffering was worse than any physical pain I'd endured. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the other women. "This is my fault. If I hadn't attacked Collins—" "No," Patience interrupted, her voice firm despite her shivers. "You did what we all wanted to do. You reminded us that we're human beings, not animals. Don't you dare apologize for that." As dawn approached, we heard footsteps outside. The door opened, revealing Mr. Whitmore himself, flanked by guards. His cold gray eyes surveyed us with disgust. "You've caused significant damage," he said calmly. "Medical equipment destroyed, routine disrupted, other slaves encouraged to rebellion. This cannot be tolerated. Please," I begged, my pride shattered by desperation. "My baby needs me. Please let me feed my baby. Your infant is being given cow's milk. She'll survive. She's only 5 months old. She needs her mother." Mr. Whitmore's expression didn't change. "What she needs is irrelevant. What I need is workers who understand their place. You 5 will serve as an example to the others. You'll spend 3 more days in this shed. No food, 1 cup of water daily. If any of you dies from the exposure, so be it. Perhaps the rest will learn that disobedience has consequences." He turned to leave, but I couldn't stop myself from shouting after him. "How can you do this? How can you call yourself a Christian while treating us like this? We're human beings. We feel pain. We love our children. We want freedom just like you. How can you look at yourself in the mirror?" Mr. Whitmore paused and looked back at me. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Doubt, guilt, something almost human. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You're not human," he said quietly. "Not in the way that matters. Your property, purchased legally, no different from my horses or my cotton. The sooner you accept that truth, the easier your life will be." The door slammed shut, leaving us in darkness. Those 3 days were the longest of my life. The cold was brutal, seeping into our bones until we couldn't stop shaking. The single cup of water they gave us each day barely wet our lips. Hunger gnawed at our stomachs. But worse was the emotional torture, being separated from our children, knowing they were suffering and unable to comfort them. Mary's wounds became infected. She developed a fever, drifting in and out of consciousness. Hannah and Patience took turns holding her, trying to keep her warm with their own body heat. Violet stopped singing and simply stared at the wall, her mind finally completely broken. On the second night, as Mary's fever peaked and she began calling for her mother, Patience whispered to me in the darkness, "If we survive this, if we ever get the chance to escape, will you promise me something?" "What?" "Promise me you'll tell the world what happened here. Tell them about the barn, about the breeding program, about children being torn from their mothers. Promise me our suffering won't be forgotten." "I promise," I whispered back, holding her frozen hands. "I promise." On the third day, when the guards finally opened the door, Violet didn't move. She died sometime during the night, quietly slipping away while the rest of us slept. The guards dragged her body out without ceremony, and I heard one of them laugh about the crazy one finally being gone. The rest of us were taken back to the barn. Grace was in her basket in my room, alive but screaming with hunger and fury. My milk had dried up during those 3 days, and despite my attempts to nurse her, she couldn't get what she needed. Rebecca had been giving her cow's milk, but Grace was rejecting it, losing weight, growing weaker. Dr. Morrison examined her and declared her acceptable but malnourished. His solution was to take her to the nursery immediately, a month earlier than planned, where she could be fed properly by wet nurses. "No," I said, my voice breaking. "Please no. Give me a few more days. My milk will come back." "Your milk is finished," Dr. Morrison said clinically. The stress and cold exposure ended your ability to nurse. The child goes to the nursery today. I fought them. Even weak from cold and hunger, I fought with everything I had. But I was no match for the guards. They pried Grace from my arms while I screamed and clawed and begged. The last image I have of my baby from that day is her tiny face, red from crying, her arms reaching for me as a guard carried her away. I collapsed on the floor of my room, sobbing so hard I thought I might die from the pain of it. Rebecca sat with me, holding me while I broke apart. "She's not gone forever," Rebecca whispered, though we both knew that wasn't true. Children in the nursery were raised by other women, visited by their mothers only occasionally, trained from birth to accept their enslavement. Grace would grow up not knowing me, not remembering my voice or my face. I would become a stranger to my own daughter. But even in my grief, even in my despair, I held on to Patience's words. I would survive, I would tell the world, and somehow, someday, I would find a way to give Grace the freedom I'd been denied. That night, as I lay in my room staring at the empty basket where Grace had slept, I heard a sound outside my door. A piece of paper slid underneath, a note written in careful script. "Help is coming. Mrs. Fletcher contacted abolitionists in Philadelphia. They're working on a plan. Be ready. Be strong. You're not alone. Daniel." I pressed the note to my chest and let myself cry. Not just tears of grief now, but tears of something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope. 3 months passed after they took Grace from me. 3 months of mechanical existence, going through the motions of survival without truly living. I saw my daughter only twice during that time. Brief supervised visits to the nursery, where she looked at me with unfamiliar eyes, already forgetting who I was. Each visit tore my heart apart, but I forced myself to stay strong. For Grace, for all of us. The note from Daniel had promised help was coming, but as winter turned to spring with no sign of rescue, I began to wonder if it had been a cruel illusion. Still, I held on to that fragile hope. It was all I had. In early April, everything began to change. It started with small things. A new guard who seemed less brutal than the others. Supplies arriving from town that included hidden messages wrapped in cloth. Whispered conversations in the barn about stirrings in the north. Abolitionists becoming more organized. The Underground Railroad expanding its network. Tensions rising between free and slave states. Then, one night, Daniel managed to speak with me during one of our forced encounters. His eyes were bright with excitement, though he kept his voice carefully controlled. "It's happening," he whispered. "The plan is in motion. There are people in Charleston, abolitionists, free black people, sympathetic whites, working together. They've been documenting evidence of illegal slave trading, of conditions on plantations. Your letter to Mrs. Fletcher started something bigger than you know." "What kind of plan?" "I can't tell you everything yet. Too dangerous if we're caught. But there's a ship captain, a man named William Garrison, named after the famous abolitionist. He runs cargo between Charleston and Philadelphia, but he's secretly been transporting escaped slaves north. He's planning something big, something that could help dozens of us at once. When? I don't know exactly, but we need to be ready. We need to have people organized, information gathered, proof of what's happening here. Can you still access Dr. Morrison's records?" I shook my head. "The office is locked, and after the uprising, they watch us more carefully." Daniel thought for a moment. "What about during his examinations? He always brings his journal with him. Could you read it then? Memorize what you see?" It was risky, but possible. During examinations, Dr. Morrison often left his journal open on the table while he worked. If I could find a way to distract him, even for a few seconds. "I'll try," I promised. Over the following weeks, I implemented the plan. During my examinations, I began asking Dr. Morrison questions about pregnancy, about health, about anything that might make him pause his work and turn away from his journal. While he explained things in his clinical, condescending manner, my eyes would dart to the open pages, memorizing names, dates, and numbers. I learned that in 5 years, Mr. Whitmore's breeding program had produced 63 children. 21 had died in infancy or been stillborn. 42 were alive, either in the nursery or sold to other plantations. The records detailed which pairings had been most successful, which traits Mr. Whitmore was trying to cultivate, even financial calculations about the program's profitability. It was systematic evil, documented in neat handwriting with precise measurements and cold statistics. Reading those pages made me physically ill, but I memorized every detail I could. Meanwhile, Rebecca and Patience were working on their own tasks. Rebecca had connections with women in the big house who could overhear Mr. Whitmore's conversations. Patience was secretly teaching more women to read and write, preparing them for whatever opportunity might come. And Daniel was coordinating with field workers, building a network of people ready to act when the time came. In mid-May, the new guard, the one who seemed different from the others, approached me while I was in the barn's courtyard, taking my brief daily exercise. He pretended to check my ankle shackles while whispering urgently. "My name is Thomas Clay. I'm working with Captain Garrison. In 2 weeks, there will be a shipment of cotton going to Charleston. A wagon large enough to hide people. We can get 6 of you out. No more, or it'll be too risky. You need to decide who goes." My heart raced. 6 people. Out of the dozens trapped in this nightmare, only 6 could escape. "How do we choose?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Choose the ones who can do the most good on the outside. The ones with stories to tell, evidence to share, connections to make. Choose the ones who can help free the others." That night, I met secretly with Rebecca, Patience, Hannah, and Daniel. We sat in the darkness, speaking in whispers, facing an impossible decision. "It has to be Lydia," Patience said immediately. "She has the records memorized, and she's smart enough to tell the story properly." "And Daniel," Rebecca added. "He has connections with field workers on other plantations. He knows names, locations, routes." "What about Mary?" Hannah asked. "She's just a child herself. She deserves a chance at freedom." We all fell silent. Mary had never recovered from watching her baby taken away. She was 16 now, pregnant again through the breeding program, and her eyes held a deadness that broke my heart. "Take me," Hannah said suddenly. "I'm older. I've been through so much. Let Mary have a chance at a real life." The discussion continued for hours. We weighed factors I'd never imagined having to consider. Who had the strongest spirit to survive the dangerous journey north? Who could articulate our suffering to people who'd never experienced it? Who had family members on other plantations who needed warning if our escape triggered wider repercussions? Finally, we chose Daniel, Mary, 2 men from the fields who'd been coordinating with Daniel, Rebecca, and me. "No," Rebecca said firmly when I told her. "Not me. I have 3 children in that nursery. I won't leave without them. But you could help free them eventually." "Eventually isn't good enough. My babies are here now. I won't abandon them. Take Patience instead. She's been documenting everything in her mind for 5 years. Her testimony would be powerful." Patience agreed, and our group of 6 was set. But there was one more impossible decision I had to make. Grace. She was 8 months old now, still in the nursery. The plan was risky enough with 6 adults. Trying to smuggle an infant made it exponentially more dangerous. A baby could cry at the wrong moment and doom us all. But how could I leave my daughter behind? Rebecca saw my struggle. "If you go, you can get help. You can bring the authorities back, shut this place down, free all the children, including Grace. But if you try to take her now and get caught, both of you die or worse." She was right, but that didn't make the decision any easier. I spent my last days before the escape visiting the nursery whenever possible, holding Grace, memorizing every detail of her face. She'd started to recognize me again, smiling when I appeared, reaching for me with her tiny hands. Each visit ended with me handing her back to the nursery women, my heart shattering a little more. The night before the escape, I wrote a letter to Grace. A letter she wouldn't read for years, if ever, but one I needed to write. I told her how much I loved her. I explained why I had to leave. I promised I would come back for her. I hid the letter in the hem of the blanket I'd made her, praying that someday she'd find it. The morning of the escape arrived. The cotton wagon was scheduled to leave at noon. Thomas Clay had arranged for the 6 of us to be assigned to loading duty. Unusual, but not suspicious enough to raise immediate alarms. The plan was to hide us beneath the cotton bales, cover us with canvas, and pray the guards didn't search too thoroughly. Everything had to go perfectly. One mistake, one suspicious glance, and we would all die. At 11 o'clock, we gathered near the barn's loading area. My hands shook as I worked alongside Daniel, Mary, Patience, and the two field workers, Samuel and Joshua. We'd tied strips of cloth around our ankles to muffle the sound of our shackles. We'd eaten what little food we could hide, knowing we wouldn't get another meal for days. Thomas Clay appeared, checking the wagon preparations. His face was carefully neutral, but I could see tension in his jaw. This was as dangerous for him as it was for us. If caught helping slaves escape, he'd face prison or worse. At 12:45, Collins appeared unexpectedly. My blood froze. He walked around the wagon, examining the cotton bales, his suspicious eyes missing nothing. "Why so many workers for one wagon?" he asked Thomas. "Big load today," Thomas replied calmly. "Master Whitmore wants it done fast." Collins grunted, but didn't leave. He continued circling the wagon, getting closer to where we'd hidden spaces beneath the cotton bales. If he looked carefully, if he noticed the slight irregularities in how the bales were stacked, then, miraculously, a commotion erupted from the barn. One of the pregnant women had gone into labor early, and she was screaming for help. Collins hesitated, torn between his suspicions and his duties. "Go," Thomas said. "We've got this under control. That woman needs attention." Collins glared at him, but finally stalked away toward the barn. As soon as he was out of sight, Thomas hissed, "Now! Move now!" We scrambled into our hiding places, cramped spaces between and beneath cotton bales, barely large enough for our bodies. The cotton dust immediately made breathing difficult. Thomas and other sympathetic workers quickly covered us with canvas and more bales, working frantically to make everything look normal. I heard Thomas climb into the driver's seat. The wagon lurched forward, and we began moving. Every jolt sent pain through my cramped limbs. The cotton pressed down on me, making me feel like I was buried alive, but I didn't dare move or make a sound. We rolled through the plantation gates. I heard guards calling out, heard Thomas responding with casual confidence. Then we were past them on the road to Charleston, and I allowed myself the tiniest breath of hope. But we weren't free yet, not even close. The journey to Charleston typically took 6 hours. For us, hidden beneath the cotton, unable to move or speak, it felt like an eternity. The spring heat was intense, and the canvas,